Hello and welcome to week 12 of our journey through government. Only a couple more weeks left, believe it or not. Of course, we got, I think, really 1.5 more lessons this year. And then in the calendar year, 2024, we'll have a couple of more weeks before we make the dramatic switch to econ. I'm using, this is a brand new video. So for those of you watching here in 2023, this isn't one of the recycled ones with some amendments that I've done earlier. I looked at the video on this unit that I did in 2020, and while all the facts were obviously still the same, the numbers were different, and I wanted to update you on the numbers that are involved in our subject for this unit called budgets. The first lesson in this unit is called a big fat budget, and that's what we're talking about here. Basically, and again, this is not going to be a surprise to you, but a budget is essentially a plan of income and expenses, usually for a year. Basically, it is profit and loss estimations, what you think you're going to bring in versus what you expect to spend, and of course, ideally, you try to make it match up. In your family, there is a budget, whether or not it's written down or not. You have an idea of how much you're going to take in, and you should ideally have an idea of how much you're going to spend, and that second total should not be a heck of a lot greater than the first. That doesn't always apply to government. We'll get to that. Now, another reason I wanted to do this was, again, when we look at these government budgets, calm down, because I'm going to share a lot of graphs with you, but I'm not going to require you to be able to regurgitate those graphs. But the graphs will give you a good visual representation of what I'm talking about here. And there I've got like 20 some of them, and I wanted to be here on the computer where I could, okay, cue slide number 126 or whatever, and kind of walk you through this. Basically, a budget again is your planned amount of money you're going to take in and how much you're going to spend. And much like with your household budget, governments have two types of spending: mandatory and discretionary or optional. Mandatory is the stuff you got to spend money on. In your house, it's of course the rent or the mortgage, depending upon whether you're buying or renting. Food, clothes, if you have a car, gasoline. Again, the things that you pretty much have to have. Your utility bill, covering water, gas, electric, sewer, all that stuff. That's called mandatory spending. At the federal government level, there are laws which dictate monies that the federal government has to spend by law. That's called mandatory spending. This is what the U.S. government is spending in this current fiscal year, 2023. Actually, no, I'm sorry, this is 2022. The 2023 doesn't begin until October 1st. We'll get to that. But under the current budget, there is, for this year, this fiscal year, 12-month period, starting October 1st of last year, mandatory outlays, that is to say the stuff that the government by law has to spend, totaled $4.1 trillion. Now, again, that is a staggering amount of money. We all know that. But if you look at these items here, you see that the two biggest mandatory outlays are healthcare and Social Security, the so-called social safety net. It is hard to believe, but in 1913, 110 years ago, which is a long time ago, but not that long a time ago, this total was zero. There was no national spending on healthcare or Social Security. And if you look a little further down the mandatory outlay list, you see the income security programs. Those did not exist. Student loan programs, those did not exist. So really about 90% of what we spend today in terms of mandatory did not exist a century and 10 years ago. And so you see, in terms of what's happened here in America, those things that we say, yes, we're willing for the government to raise money to pay for these things, that list has gone from here to here. and it is expanding even as we speak. So just in the course of a few generations here, we've gone from a government that spent in the millions to a government that spends in the trillions. Now, yes, inflation plays a role in that. We'll get into more on that in econ, obviously, but it doesn't explain all of that. If the government was still spending today on the things it was 110 years ago, even adjusted for inflation, it would still be just a little more than $1 billion or so dollars, not 4.1 trillion. Again, every government agency, from Congress, which is the largest spender on the planet, to the smallest little town, has something resembling a budget. Again, a plan that shows what we expect to take in and what we plan to spend it on. Now, of course, at all three levels of government, there are requests for funds. People want to, of course, and again, as we have moved along, the arc of American government history has been that we give government more priorities to spend money on. We have collectively decided that roads are something we will spend money on, and that it is a proper function of government. Healthcare is, again, for all of the debate, it is something that most people, have agreed that, yes, there is a role for government to spend on health care. The only thing we're debating now is the scope of that. And, of course, just 10 years ago, that was the basis for a lot of debate among politicians as to how much was too much. There are those who want every single healthcare entity to be under the auspices of the federal government. That would be exceedingly costly, of course, but again, as we've seen, money is increasingly no object. Elected officials have to make decisions about spending ostensibly for the good of others, but we know how this works. 435 members of the House representing every person in the U.S., and all 435 of those districts want something more than what they're getting. We're going to talk a little more about that in a second. So much like a family has to decide, okay, I would like to get that 72-inch TV, but we don't have the money for it. Therefore, we're just going to tough it out with the 27-inch TV that works perfectly fine. Again, the government has to set priorities. Again, as we go back to slide 129 here, the amount that we have to spend, again, mandatory means must, got to spend these. These are not negotiable, and these levels here of prices are also largely not negotiable. There are federal funding indexes that dictate how much we're going to spend on these priorities, and you have to do them by law. Basically, when a government draws up a budget, the procedure usually goes something like this. Executive departments, remember all those myriad of departments we talked about at the federal level? All of them send budget requests to the White House and to Congress. Congress, of course, again, separation of powers, Congress appropriates the money. The executive largely spends it. There is some judicial spending, of course, and there is some legislative spending to maintain Congress and its staff. But most of the federal dollars that are spent by various executive agencies. After collecting all these budget requests, the chief executive then, of course, in the U.S., that's president. In the state, that's a governor. Here in the city of Danville, it's a city manager. Again, remember, New York, though, that falls to whom? The mayor. The mayor is the chief executive of New York City. And they put together a budget and send it to that level of government's legislative body. Of course, federal, it's Congress. In Virginia, it's the General Assembly. In Danville, it is Danville City Council. In Pennsylvania County, it is the Pennsylvania County Board of Supervisors. And they adopt a budget after making whatever changes they see fit, and it goes into effect. And budgets are amended all the time during the course of a fiscal year. Matter of fact, a lot of what Congress does is pass budget amendments that meet new spending priorities as they arise. We do that in your household budget, too. Your household budget might not account for a brand new refrigerator. But when the old one goes bad, then all of a sudden you got to find money for a new refrigerator, and you have to make a budget amendment, so to speak. Here's the problem. You have 435 members of the House of Representatives, and of course 100 senators who represent those same people. Every one of those 435 districts wants more. No matter how much they get, more is better. You've got 435 members of the House of Representatives who are being pressured by their people to get a little more. No one wants less. And so what happens? It goes up and up and up and up. There's an old saying, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. Once, your book says this almost with a tongue-in-cheek, it is easier to get a government program started than it is to get one stopped. Yes, by quite a bit. Because remember, when you're spending money on something, people, entities are benefiting. And once they start benefiting from that, you don't want to stop benefiting. So if you do pull that money out, what happens? Those people get very angry at you, Mr. or Mrs. Congressman, and they will not vote for you. So what happens? You've got 435 members of Congress whose future as a member of Congress depends upon them bringing home bacon to their district. There is zero incentive right now for any one of those 435 members of Congress to say, hey, let's spend a little bit less. Because that's not how you get reelected. This shows you from 1934 to really only 2017, the revenue and the spending of the federal government. This is not an increase. This is an exponential explosion. Again, because you have 435 people who know they can get reelected and reelected as long as they keep bringing home the bacon. This is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. There is zero incentive for them to spend less. Zero. Now, how does this end? I don't know. And I don't think I'm going to be around to find out. That's going to fall on you guys. Wish I had some advice for you. I do not. But there's also, quite frankly, if you head up an agency, let's say you're the head of Danville Public Works Department, because this works at a local level too, and you get allocated $1 million for this budget. If you only spend $675,000 of that, then obviously the people that write the check say, hey, y'all can get by with a cut, can't you? Well, you don't want that. It's the last thing you want. So what are you going to do? You're going to spend that money. You're going to spend every last dime of that money to justify your job. If your job depended upon you spending money, what you going to do? You're going to spend money. So there is no incentive either from those who are in government to spend less. When you add all that up, what do you think is going to happen? Slide 136 is what happens, and it keeps happening. And if we were to take this and make it a little bit wider to get the last 5 fiscal years, that exponential increase continues at an even greater pace. We'll show you some of that in a second. Hang on. Here we go. This is something a little bit more up to date. See what happened right there in 2020, where we went from spending $4.75 trillion to $6.07, and then the following year to go up to $7.13. Well, pandemic happened, of course, and again, our leaders decided that the way to help everybody recover from the pandemic was to print up a spitload of money and throw it at them. As we will learn in econ next semester, that produces inflation. So even though you're spending a lot more and you might have gotten a nice little check from the government, those dollars are worth much less than they were just a couple of years ago. Basically, and you'll see again, slide 123 here, the red bars is what we spent. The green is what we took in. Do you see how in every year except for a couple there in the early 2000s that red bar is much higher than the accompanying green bar? Those are annual deficits. Deficit is what you have left over when you spend more than you take in. Accumulated deficit is debt. Our national debt is now approaching $30 trillion. It's an unfathomable amount of money. And I will never cease to be amazed at how people can look at this consistent spending more than we take in and think, this is okay. Because how does the government make it up? Well, one way you do that is to print money. What happens when you print money? Inflation. Those dollars are worth less and less and less. But again, that's what happens when you have 435 people whose jobs depend upon spending more money. That's what happens when you have 1.1 million members of the executive branch whose jobs are justified by spending money. There is no incentive to spend less. At the local level, you can get into that a little bit. But boy, howdy, at the federal level, just a couple of things here. Because we're tossing around the word trillion now like it's a nickel. Couple of things. How much is a trillion? Your book has some examples. If you had spent $1 million a day since the birth of Christ, you still will not have yet spent $1 trillion. $1 million each day over the past 2,000 years, still well short of $1 trillion. At the time of this book was written, the total debt of the federal government was approaching $20 trillion. It was written in 2017. It's now over $30 trillion. Again, we showed you the graph earlier about the mandatory spending, and you remember that that clocked in the current budget at $4.1 trillion. That's slide 129. Well, the next slide, slide 130, looks at so-called discretionary outlays. These are the things you don't have to spend by law, but we're spending anyway. You see it's divided up into two here, non-defense and defense. Believe it or not, every dollar we spend on the military is discretionary. There is no law in the U.S. Code that dictates that we have to spend a penny on military. Of course, you have to, particularly when you have the defense burden that the United States does. So, yeah, discretionary outlays, $751 billion spent last year on the military. And you'll look at the non-defense, which covers nearly $1 trillion. Again, that's health. That's not that $141 billion up there saying health. That is stuff that's not already required by law, but we do it additionally. Ditto with education, veterans benefits, transportation. This is spending that goes above and beyond the legal minimum for these outlays. So $4.1 trillion mandatory, $1.7 trillion discretionary, $5.8 trillion is the size of the current federal budget. And you'll go back to slide 123, you'll see in 2021, we actually spent more than that. Again, coronavirus and the coronavirus recovery skews these numbers just a little bit. But again, the trend was always going up, and it's still going to be mostly going up. Where does the government get their money from? Well, there's a whole lot of things here. You'll see in the bottom part of this the revenues, that is to say the amount of money that the federal government spends. I'm going to increase the size of this, even though this graphic does not really lend itself to that. And you'll see that outer green ring there, 10% of the gross domestic product comes from individual income taxes. That's the taxes on your income. The little circle below that, the payroll taxes, we call that FICA. That is the taxes that are taken out of your paycheck, from your paycheck, and also from the company that employs you. For those of you, for those who are employed by someone else, I'm self-employed, so I got to pay all this all at once. But yeah, the FICA is big, and you'll notice that between those two, that's the lion's share of the total revenues of the federal government. Corporate income taxes, the third little circle there is was once a much bigger slice of the pie. That's now been knocked back just a little bit. And those are straight taxes on corporations. Again, large businesses of a certain threshold have to pay these extra. And again, this is on top of the stuff that you already paid. The stuff in the very bottom, the other, that was pretty much all that our government subsisted on before the 20th century. Fees, import duties, things like that. When you go into a national park and give $30 to get in, that's a government fee, something like that. So yeah, the lion's share of what the government takes in comes from John Q. taxpayer and their employer. What do we spend it on? Holy smokes! We've looked at the. Now, there's one other expenditure we have not mentioned here, and I'm going to try to bring up a slide that here we go. Remember when we talked about the debt, which is an accumulation of annual deficits? That's how much we owe, basically. There's interest on that. Again, in econ, we'll talk about interest being sort of the juice fuel for a capitalistic economy. Federal interest payments have gone up quite a bit over recent years. Why? Because we consistently spend more than we take in. And as a result, the interest we pay on that is going up and up every year and is becoming a much bigger line item every year. So again, as if you would need any more incentive to spend within your means, the fact that your interest payments every year is getting a whole lot bigger should tell you everything you need to know. I'm going to get a little personal here for just a second. We're going to talk about state and local taxation here in a second, but I wanted to interject this in and have this be a topic of discussion on Monday. I'm going to get a little passionate here. My political philosophy personally is libertarian. I believe we should have no more government than is absolutely necessary, and that for every a bit of authority that government assumes, that is less personal individual freedom that we have. The more we surrender our decision-making to Washington or Richmond, the less individual agency we have. One of the most popular sayings for libertarian is taxation is theft. It's almost said in a pejorative sense all the time when someone finds out you're a libertarian. Oh, hey, taxation is theft, right? Anyway, it is. It's legal theft. It is very legal. The government, most certainly the Constitution, gives the government the authority to tax. But what is theft? Theft is taking property from another person or group without their express consent. That's it. That is theft. Now, there are those who say, well, because you choose to live in this country, you are giving permission to be taxed. I disagree with that. You're assuming permission in a situation where I'm not allowed to deny that permission. If I had a chance to say no, then yes, you could say, well, the fact that you're here indicates you say yes. The idea behind it, though, is not to have us, draw pitchforks or whatever. Certainly we need to be vigilant on the whole idea of taxes. The idea is, taxation is theft, is to remind us that in a truly free society, taxation should be the absolute last resort to solving a problem. When all other recourses have failed, this problem still exists, okay, now we'll talk taxation. We don't do that. It is the first thing we look at. It is our default setting. And if I can do nothing else in this class but just to make you realize that taxation is not a birthright. It's not something that governments can do all the time just because they're the government. It's something, again, we have to be very vigilant about. It should not be used unless it's absolutely necessary. Now, again, there are lots of things that we figure the government is needed for. Roads, police, court, jail, military. Again, we we agree that these needs need to be met. And of course, we can also agree that, ultimately we're going to have to raise some taxes, but now we do it all the time, and often without thinking. Anytime you stop thinking, that's just a bad thing. We'll say a couple of notes about the state. Again, the process is similar at the state level. Of course, we're going to focus on Virginia. The Virginia General Assembly gets a budget proposal from the governor, and he takes it, his requests, much like President sends it to Congress, Governor sends it to the Virginia General Assembly, and the 140 lawmakers there will hem and haw, add and subtract, and come up with a budget. Big difference here. Big difference. Remember the graph that showed you the deficit we run each year, spending more money at the federal level than we take in? You can't do that in Virginia. 48, I believe, of all the 50 states have a balanced budget requirement. They cannot spend more than they take in. It makes sense because what's the one thing that the federal government can do that states can't? Well, actually, there's plenty, but in terms of taxation, they can print money. Yeah, when you can print the currency, you have a little bit more leeway. Virginia doesn't print money as a state, and so the process is a little different in Virginia. Also, another little difference here, Virginia operates on a biennial budget. That means they adopt a budget that covers a 2-year period. Most other states and the federal government operate on an annual budget. Every year you pass a budget. But in Virginia, even-numbered years, you pass a 2-year budget. In the odd-numbered years, you make all kinds of budget amendments. You adjust it on the fly as the needs arise. But again, the state budget in Virginia has to be balanced by state law, and 48 other states have that requirement. So it's a whole different animal. It's a completely different process. Of course, the numbers are much smaller at the state level. Although we say that, the state of California has the 5th biggest budget on planet Earth. They are bigger than all but 4 nations. That's how big California is, how many people they have, how many just stuff they have. It's a big scope. So yeah, that state government is bigger than most every other nation. Same thing happened, and I'll show you here just a little bit, slide 137. This is the current Virginia budget for the 23-24 fiscal year, just the general fund revenues. So it's a little different in Virginia. They have a general fund, then they have funds for other parts of government. I mean, it all is under the same umbrella, though. But you'll see, in terms of where the state gets their money from, most of it is from individual income taxes. When you start earning paychecks, you will see federal taxes, you'll see our old buddy FICA, and you will see Virginia state taxes. And again, pie chart tells us it's about over 2/3 of what the state takes in comes from your paychecks. In terms of, this is where the state money goes in Virginia. You'll see the big green pie piece up here at the top. That's Health and Human Resources. Again, the federal Medicare, Medicaid programs, they're paid for out of the federal budget, but they're administered at the state level. So the feds will send the states money to do, and again, this is where a lot of the spending goes. The equally sized pie slice at the bottom is K through 12 education. Again, we have decided that one of the proper functions of government is public education. And because the Constitution does not give that power to the federal government, it falls to the states, and so every state, pretty much one of their biggest expenditures is K through 12 education. You'll see higher ed over here. Virginia spends more than most states as a percentage on higher ed. To the right, public safety. That's Virginia State Police, State Bureau of Investigations, things like that. And of course, little red over here, debt service, Virginia. This is not a deficit, though. This is not like the federal debt, I should say, where we have 30 trillion of accumulated debt because of taking in less than we spend. This is from debt financing. That is to say, Virginia starts a major road project and they borrow $100 million to make it happen. That's the kind of debt service we're talking about here. So it's quite different at the state level. we'll knock it down a notch and look at the local level. And again, it's the same process here, more or less, in the city of Danville than it is at the state and federal levels. Hang tight. All right, as we look at this is the city of Danville. And this is where the revenues come from, the revenues that fund city government. You'll see the two biggest pieces are general property tax and other local taxes. General property tax is the tax on your real estate, home taxes that you pay. Usually it's wrapped up into your mortgage and you pay it where you don't even see it. The other local taxes, mostly in Danville, that is personal property tax, car tax or so. City forgives a certain amount of that, but any car value above $20,000 is taxed. Again, remember what we talked about last week with the Dillon Rule? The Dillon Rule is Virginia and several other states have adopted the Dillon Rule back in the 19th century. Basically, it means that the cities and counties are subservient to the state, much like the state is subservient to the federal government. Where there is a conflict of state and federal law is the one you follow. In Virginia, one of the consequences of the Dillon Rule is that cities and counties are only able to tax certain things. Dillon Rule is very restrictive in what a locality, city or county, can tax. You can tax property, you can tax real estate, you can tax meals, you can tax hotels, rooms, lodging taxes. There's a cigarette tax in Danville. There is what's called a B-Poll tax, business professional occupator's license. It's not really a tax, that's more of a fee. There's a machinery and tools tax for large industries. With certain pieces of machinery, they pay a little bit there. But it's a very limited group of commodities and sources that cities and counties can use because of the Dillon Rule. For example, 3 years ago, the city of Danville saw a big need for school renovation projects, and of course that is just insanely expensive. And paying for it usually means you borrow a spitload of money and go into debt and try to pay it off. The state sales tax is 4.5% in Virginia. That's one of the taxes that a locality cannot levy under the Dillon Rule. So the city of Danville could not add in a 6% local tax. In many other states, they do. If you buy something in the city of Los Angeles, it's going to cost you measurably more than it would in Los Angeles County. Again, they are allowed to have municipal taxes there. We're not in Virginia. But what we did was, in 2020, the city of Danville asked the General Assembly of Virginia for permission to add a penny to the local sales tax for 20 years. In order to fund school renovations. It had to be approved by the General Assembly, and it had to be approved by voters in a direct referendum. So even with the Dillon Rule, you can get around that. But again, you basically have to get on your hands and knees and beg the state, and of course beg your people for that. Pennsylvania County has done the same. Halifax County has done the same. But you have to get state permission. City council could not have one day voted in a 1-cent sales tax to pay for school constructions. Can't do that in Virginia because of the Dillon Rule. We assume that we need government to maintain something resembling an orderly society, and we assume that we will have to pay taxes to government to make this happen. Again, taxation is theft, but it's legal theft. And we have agreed collectively that there are things we are willing to be taxed in order to accomplish. The key to that is to come up with some kind of consensus on what is and is not a proper function of government. Our American system of government, of course, governed by the Constitution, which outlines that only specific delegated powers are given to the government, and while the citizens are supposed to retain the bulk of political power. It hasn't quite worked out like that, obviously, but again, that's supposed to be our foundation. That's where we start. Could the federal government constitutionally undertake a program of internal improvements, like roads, for instance? You remember our old friend, the Cumberland Road from years ago? It was the first foray of the federal government into providing transportation at the federal level. And over the years, we have collectively determined that it is a good idea for federal government to have a role in interstate transportation. You remember the story I told you a while back during the Civil War, because the Confederate capital was in Richmond in central Virginia, and most of the states as they represented were well to the south. When they went home, they had to get on trains. Most of them had to stop in Danville for as part of a train layover. Why? Because the state of North Carolina, in trying to get an economic advantage on everyone else, changed the gauge of the railroad tracks in their state. So the train that ran in Virginia could not run in North Carolina. You had to get on another train to go into Carolina. And you can see where that would be a pain in the butt. So we collectively decided that, yes, there is a role for the federal government to play in establishing transportation. Also, we've decided that the federal government has a role in interstate commerce, ports, and things like that. The establishment of a national bank was a great debate in the 19th century. And once that happened, then our very economy changed. Again, though, that question you asked, is that a proper function of government? We should always ask that question. We should never assume that it is. And I think, unfortunately, today we automatically assume if it's a good idea, then that means it's a good idea for government to fund it. No. Let me get a little Christian-y on you here. In terms of providing relief to the poor, we have basically subcontracted out the lion's share of that duty to the government. We rely on the government to provide this charity. And we have decided, again collectively, not me personally, but we have decided that we as a society are willing to pay more in taxes in order to help people who are financially or otherwise bad off. As a Christian, that's not the way we're supposed to do it. We are commanded by God to help our fellow man because, number one, it's the right thing to do. Number two, you, the giver, get a spiritual benefit out of that. By doing these good works, you get just a little closer to touching the face of God. But what happens when you subcontract out somebody else to do it? The good stuff's getting done still, but you're not getting any spiritual benefit. You're giving help without hope. You are doing a good thing but not getting any benefit from it. We want to do good things. We want these people to be helped, but we're supposed to be doing that ourselves. What's the last great hospital that was built with Christian charity money? I can't think of it. What's the last great university built? Now, we do have an example here in our area. Liberty University was a privately formed school, and certainly was founded with a Christian mission. But that used to be the rule, not the exception. Because we've subcontracted this out to the government, great charities, mostly Christian in nature, have not had to develop hospitals, sanatoriums, things like that, orphanages, to help people. We've subcontracted that out to the government. And I think we've lost a little bit of our soul in the process. A good friend of mine is one of the top fundraising executives at Avert University, and they had a long pipeline of students from Finland, Scandinavian nation, well over 1,000 over the years. So several years ago, when Avert was launching a big capital campaign, big fundraiser to build, several extra things, they said, "Well, let's go to Finland." I mean, they've got like 2,500 alumni there, and they're all well-to-do. Let's see if we can hit them up. They flew to Finland. They had a great time. Their trip was a spectacular failure. You want to know why? The people of Finland have no concept of of philanthropy. To them, they live in a society where the government does all that. There's no need for public charity in Finland or Norway or Sweden. That's all handled through the government. Now, yes, the government takes half your paycheck to make this happen. But they're nice people. Not a bad one, among them, but I think they've lost a little bit of their soul. They have no concept of the spiritual good that you get from doing these great things. In America, we haven't gone to that point yet where the government does everything. But Scandinavia is kind of what it looks like. And they're not bad people. They're great people. But I think they've lost a bit of their soul. Because to them, they live in a world where all good comes from government. Anyway. The other idea, and I wanted to share this other anecdote with you as well. When we talk about the idea of public assistance, nobody's an ogre. Nobody wants anybody to suffer. I see suffering and it breaks my heart. But I also know that it is short-sighted to give relief in the way that we've become way too accustomed to. A couple of things I'm going to use to kind of follow up on that. This reads like it was written from another planet. Grover Cleveland was president late 19th century, and I'm going to read you something. He vetoed a congressional bill that would have spent $10,000 in the year 1887 to help farmers in Texas who had a major drought. In his veto message, this is what Cleveland said. I'm just going to read this straight up and just soak these words in. I'm not going to ask you to regurgitate them, but it's interesting. He said, "I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering, which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. A prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadily resisted, to the end that the lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people." That last line sounds harsh, but it is true. Cleveland believed that private charity should and would assist struggling farmers. And in this case, he was right. When word got around about the presidential veto of this congressional expenditure, several private charities in the region banded together, and instead of being able to split $10,000, those drought-stricken farmers were able to split $100,000. When the Depression hit in 1929, the federal government began to provide assistance to states, but not to individuals, because there were still enough people in Congress who thought that such individual assistance was not an appropriate function of government. That line of thinking no longer exists. Today, Americans do not question whether or not the government should undertake these programs. The only question is to the degree. The law of unintended consequences applies in cases where government does something and what happens is something they did not plan for. The best recent example I could remember happened in I think it was the mid-1990s under then President Clinton. There was a push from some lawmakers, Democratic side, to tax the rich in order to pay for something. I can't remember exactly what they were trying to generate revenue for. But they didn't want to tax John and Jane taxpayer. They wanted to tax the rich. So they came up with the idea to impose, I think it was a 40% luxury tax on yachts. Who buys yachts? Joe and Jane six-pack don't. The rich do. The idea was to tax yachts, this luxury tax, 40% I believe it was, in order to raise I don't know, round figure, $50 billion to pay for this other good thing that they wanted to pay for. Here's the problem. In general, rich people do not get to be rich by being dumb with their money. Much like earlier in this video, we talked about you choosing whether or not to buy the 72-inch TV when you have the 27-inch. It's working just fine. Rich people looked at this 40% tax on yachts and decided, that's a luxury I can do without. I'm not going to pay that for a yacht. So what happened? Well, yacht sales went down about 80%. So instead of generating $50 billion, which you've already spent or earmarked, you said you're going to spend it for this, you only brought in $10 million. So now, what do you have? You have a $40 billion hole in the budget. You also have the group of people over here who are supposed to be helped by all this money that you were going to be raising. Now they're not getting helped. And they were promised that help. And now you got to find $40 billion elsewhere to fill this need that your revenue is, that your tax is not bringing in. Another unintended consequence. Who builds the yachts? It's not the rich people. It's the carpenters. It's the electricians. It's the craftsmen, the tradesmen and women who put these things together. A whole industry built around the construction of yachts. When they are selling 80% fewer yachts, what happens? People get laid off. People lose their jobs, their hours. So now, in addition to these people who are not getting the $50 billion you promised them, now you've got thousands of people over here who are drawing unemployment because they don't have work, because you basically taxed their industry out of existence. That's unintended consequences, and we should always try to be aware of those. Again, and maybe, if we get a little sanity going on here, we will realize that taxing and spending is not always the answer. One of the goals of some tax policy is behavior modification. That doesn't work. The so-called sin taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and things like that are supposed to dissuade people from using these products. Well, okay, we're going to add this tax on cigarettes and take in $100 billion, and we've already got it spent, of course. Oh, fewer people are consuming the products now. We're only bringing in $30 billion. See what the problem is? Plus, in the battle between law, doing what's legal, and appetite, doing what you want, always bet over here on appetite. People will get what they want. Prohibition, the most egregious example of that. When it's working, our economic system is supposed to be enable people to enjoy the rewards of hard work, to build wealth where they can, and to use that wealth to generate other wealth, to pay for providing jobs for others. One thing I want to talk about in class with you Monday is the idea, and again, we're going to be getting into so much more of this in econ. You'll get sick of it. But these questions that we ask invite us to look again at the underlying assumptions about how we do government, and more specifically, taxing and spending. To change the direction that the government's been heading in for the past few generations is going to mean a major change in the way we think, the way we see government. The idea that there are some things government does not need to spend money on. If we want the direction of government to change, the change has to start somewhere. Unfortunately, again, we have 435 elected members of Congress who have zero incentive to spend less. You have 1 million federal employees who have zero incentive to spend as little money as possible. Again, I don't mean to seem doom and gloom here, but these are things you guys are going to have to figure out. It is not sustainable. Anyway, on that pleasant note, I'll see you Monday. Again, we're not going to memorize graphs, but I want to talk about the morality of taxation and basically just how it fleshes with a so-called free society. We'll see you on Monday.